The new buyer-broker agreement is now live, and in this video, we're going to walk you through each part of it provision by provision. We're going to highlight some of the key points that those of you who are members of the National Association of Realtors need to keep in mind. We'll also explain what OREC's role is in all of these industry changes that you're hearing about, and we'll introduce the new compensation supplement that will probably be one of your go-to forms as you move forward. Our team has been very busy creating resources to help you all out, so if you want to check those out, head over to our website at orec.ok.gov. You'll hover over resources and click on the updated BBA and other practice changes tab, or you can just click the link in the description below. At that website, you'll find a copy of the new buyer-broker agreement, a downloadable PDF with about 40 frequently asked questions, the new cooperative compensation supplement, the residential sales contract, links to the NAR resource page with a ton of information for those of you who are Realtor members or MLS participants, and a link to the Oklahoma Association of Realtors legal line for any of your legal questions. So you might want to go ahead and pull up those documents as you watch this video and get ready to take some notes. Now, we've published this form for your optional use in transactions. It is not required, whether you are a Realtor member or not. Now, if you are a Realtor member and you'd want to dive deeper into the NAR settlement and really master the buyer-broker agreement ahead of the changes, you'll definitely want to go check out our website, go to orec.ok.gov, hover over the Education tab and click on Approved CE Course List. There will be a search box in the middle of the screen. If you type in buyer broker into that search bar, you'll be able to find a list of approved CE courses that are available right now. We really encourage you to not just take this video and let that be the last education that you get, because you really want to be able to master the buyer consultation and master the buyer broker agreement. And this is going to be the intro to mastering the buyer broker agreement. So let's set the stage for today's video. First, again, we're not going to cover everything about the NAR settlement here. That's really not our place. The state of Oklahoma isn't a part of the settlement agreement, and we're not the regulatory body enforcing any of the MLS practice changes as a result of that NAR settlement. Remember, we have thousands of licensees across the state who aren't NAR members or MLS participants. So while we're discussing the OREC buyer-broker agreement today, the NAR settlement only requires a written agreement before giving a buyer a property tour, not specifically the buyer-broker agreement. Now, as a broker, you can definitely use a different written agreement, but we will be showing you in this video why the OREC buyer-broker agreement is a great resource to meet the requirements of that NAR settlement and to have transparency with your buyers in general. So what exactly is the role of the Real Estate Commission in the real estate industry? Let's break it down with this visual hierarchy of regulatory bodies that you see on your screen right now. At the base, you'll see the Real Estate Commission. We're the entry point to the industry, and we're responsible for promoting good business practices for both consumers and licensees. If you want to practice real estate in Oklahoma, you need a real estate license, and we're the state government arm that issues your license. We also investigate and prosecute any violations of the Oklahoma Real Estate License Code and Rules. Our commission also publishes statewide contracts and forms, like the one you're learning about today, that are used in transactions through what's called the Contract Forms Committee. Now, this committee is made up of 6 attorneys and 12 brokers representing areas from across the state. These people volunteer their time to create and maintain our library of nearly 80 different contracts and forms. Moving up the hierarchy, you have the national, state, and local associations of realtors. These are private professional organizations that licensees can join, which have higher practice standards outlined, for example, in the Code of Ethics. These groups advocate for real estate professionals at the local, state, and national level. Next is the Multiple Listing Service, or the MLS. You know that this is the data hub for property listings. MLS members, they must follow the MLS rules and regulations. So if you're hearing things about the NAR settlement, the MLS is where the enforcement is going to happen in regards to whether you had a written agreement or not. You want to make sure that you're staying in touch and in tune with your local, state, and national association if you are a member, and certainly your MLS. At the top of the hierarchy, you have your broker. This is your supervisor for all things that you do in real estate. Each broker has their own policies and procedures for conducting business. Your broker might have different policies and procedures regarding the changes that are coming. What we're talking about today is the baseline from the Real Estate Commission's perspective. So regardless of your membership in any organization or your brokerage affiliation, every licensed real estate professional in Oklahoma is accountable to the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission. So when you hear about that NAR settlement agreement, the enforcement again of those practice changes that are outlined in the settlement falls to the MLS. For instance, some licensees that specialize in commercial real estate, they may not be members of the MLS or any realtor organization. They probably have other organizations that they are members of and they are accountable to, but they have a broker and they have a real estate license. That is how the regulatory bodies work. The updates to the buyer-broker agreement that we're discussing today came from OREC's Contract Forms Committee, ensuring compliance with all relevant laws and regulations regardless of any organization memberships that you may be part of. Now, if you've been in the industry for a while, you might have heard something like buyer-broker agreements aren't worth the paper that they're printed on. Well, I want to tell you that that is no longer the case. I understand, coming from the industry myself, that for some, having a buyer-broker agreement signed up front might be a totally new way of doing business. And for others, it's business as usual. As we review each provision of this agreement, I encourage you to think about it like this. Every other professional that a consumer engages with requires some sort of paperwork that outlines the terms and conditions of the service and the expectations of both parties. Wouldn't you find it kind of strange if you hired an attorney and they didn't provide any documents up front that ensures your confidentiality? Or if you went to a new doctor and they didn't have you sign any paperwork? Now, some of us might celebrate not having to sign any paperwork or fill out 18 forms, but nevertheless, you get my point. Whether it's a financial advisor, an investment manager, an accountant, or a contractor, they all have some sort of agreement, and the same is now the case for the buying side in real estate. Consumers are used to signing agreements when they work with professionals. You'd never go out and you'd take a listing, pay for the photography, stage the property, and advertise it without a written agreement with the seller of your expectations for them and their expectations for you, and how compensation is laid out. So moving forward, buyers are no different. Now, the great thing about this new buyer-broker agreement is that it's not all totally new. It was modeled after the existing buyer-broker agreement that we've had for years. It sets clear expectations for the services that are to be provided, outlines compensation, defines the duration of the agreement, whether it's one day or one weekend or one property or one neighborhood. So it's really flexible enough to cover most of the scenarios that you'll encounter. So let's dive into the changes of the new buyer-broker agreement from the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission. Like I said, the committee kept as much as they could from the previous agreement as possible. For instance, as we dive into paragraph 1, that really remains the same. It states the purpose of the business relationship and the services that you might provide, whether you're helping a client purchase or lease a property. Moving on to paragraph 2, this ensures both the broker and the buyer acknowledge that a written agreement must be signed before showing properties. In paragraph 3, the buyer is confirming that they haven't signed another active written agreement with another broker. Moving on to paragraph number 4, this includes a new buyer affidavit that comes from state law, Senate Bill 212. You may have heard about this. This provision explains that Oklahoma law requires all buyers to sign an affidavit at closing, attesting that they are either a U.S. citizen, a Native American, or a non-citizen who is or shall become a bona fide resident of Oklahoma. And we added this to the buyer's broker agreement for brokers to remember to discuss this up front, just to make sure that you're helping your buyers ensure that they meet the requirements and that they're willing to sign that affidavit at closing. Now, as we go through each provision, you'll find that these are great discussion points for a buyer consultation. And you being able to explain each provision is going to make you the professional. If you want more details about Senate Bill 212, we have a video that is linked in the description below. Next, in paragraph 5, you determine the agreement's length. If you leave this part blank, it defaults to 60 days. Now, during this period, the buyer agrees that all inquiries that they make for property and negotiations on property will go through you as their broker. The flexibility here allows you to set the agreement for as little as 1 day up to 1 year. Now, after setting that agreement length, paragraph 6 outlines what happens if the agreement is terminated. Now, this is a change from the previous version. Previously, it was mutual consent, meaning both parties had to agree. Now, either party can cancel the agreement with 3 business days written notice, except if the buyer is already under contract to purchase a property. Now, if the agreement is canceled, there's a provision to protect your compensation for a set period on any property that you showed that buyer. If you leave this part blank, it defaults to 60 days. That means if you showed them 123 Main Street and they cancel that agreement, then they go directly to the listing agent. Within that 60 days, you're still owed your compensation. Next up, let's talk about compensation. And this is covered in the next 3 paragraphs. So here's the gist. Paragraph 7, this is where the fees that you're charging to your buyer for your brokerage services are disclosed. Paragraph 8, this is what happens with compensation if a contract falls through. Paragraph 9, these are the options when a seller contributes to the buyer's broker compensation. So we're going to go through each one of these one by one. Paragraph 7 starts by making sure that the buyer understands that compensation is fully negotiable and not set by law. This is a requirement from that NAR settlement. It also says that the agreement isn't enforceable if the compensation section is left blank. So, don't expect it to hold up if you haven't filled this part out. There are 3 ways that you can be compensated. Box A, the buyer pays the broker at closing either a specific dollar amount or a percentage of the final selling or leasing price. If the seller or another broker contributes to your compensation, the buyer gets a credit for that amount. Box B, this is for retainer fees. Some brokers charge a retainer fee for services to buyers. If you choose this route, the fee is due when the agreement is signed, and it is applied toward the compensation due at closing if you've selected anything in Box A. Note that this fee is non-refundable if you don't close on the property. And remember, all compensation, including retainer fees, must be payable to your brokerage, not directly to you as a sales associate. Box C, this box is left blank to provide, again, some flexibility in how you'll be compensated. You'll want to make sure that anything you put in here, your broker knows about what you're putting there so you can stay in compliance with their policies. You might list a transaction fee here or something similar. Check with your broker and make sure that whatever you put in there is in compliance with your brokerage policies. Most of the time, you'll likely use Box A by putting a specific dollar amount or whatever fee that you charge for your buyer broker services. The last part of this paragraph informs consumers that if you show them a property after signing this agreement, and the agreement is terminated or it expires, the compensation that you listed is still due at closing. This wording is similar to the termination clause in paragraph 6, but it applies if the agreement expires as well. Again, the default number of days here is 60 days after expiration or termination, but you can adjust the number of days as needed on a case-by-case scenario. Now, imagine if you have a client interested in new construction, for example. You spend your time showing them various neighborhoods, neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood, and they finally find the perfect spot for them. But there's a catch. All of the spec homes are at least 90 days away from being move-in ready. The buyers go home to think it over, and the next morning they drive through the neighborhood again and run into the builder. Well, the builder tells them it'll be 90 days before a property is ready and offers them a better deal if they don't work with a real estate professional. Now, you can imagine how a naive buyer would believe that and go forward with that builder on a hush-hush deal. So if you left that termination or expiration clause at the default 60 days, the buyers could wait it out and then contract with that builder, leaving you without commission despite all of your work up until that point. Again, this really underscores the importance of having a great buyer consultation, being able to know the needs of your buyer, the wants and desires of your buyer, and what their ultimate goal is, so you can adjust your buyer agreement to fit that specific client. Now, what if you go under contract on a property and it doesn't close? Well, paragraph 8 outlines 2 scenarios. If it's the seller's fault, the compensation is waived, and you're back to square one with your buyers. Now that will probably put your buyers at ease, knowing that if the seller does breach the contract, that the buyer's not having to still pay you. But if the buyer breaches the contract, the compensation is not waived and it is due immediately. Now this will ensure that your buyer understands that there's more at stake than just the earnest money deposit that they put down when placing a property under contract, effectively making it unavailable to other buyers in the market until they close. So far in the agreement, you've determined the duration of the agreement, what happens if it's terminated, how you'll be compensated as a buyer's broker, and what happens if there's a failure to close after going under contract. So now let's talk about what happens if a seller or a listing broker offers compensation to a buyer's broker. The amount the seller offers could be equal to, greater than, or less than the fee that you specified in paragraph 7. It's really one of three options. Now, if the seller's offer of compensation matches the amount that you have in paragraph 7, great news. The buyer isn't obligated to pay you separately since the seller's covering it. Now, if the seller offers you more than what's listed in paragraph 7, the buyer still doesn't need to pay you separately because the seller is covering it. Now, what happens to that excess amount? You have three options. It can either be a credit to the buyer, as long as the lender and laws allow it. It can be a credit to the seller, or another option that's agreed to in writing by all parties. Now, Realtor members and MLS participants, you really want to consult with your broker and your MLS regarding the ability to amend the buyer-broker agreement to accept more compensation than what you have initially agreed to in this buyer-broker agreement. Now, for those of you who are not Realtor members or you're not MLS participants, you can amend this agreement to accept more. Whatever option that you choose must be agreed to in writing by all parties. Anytime the seller offers more compensation than what's listed in paragraph 7, the difference must be negotiated and agreed to in writing. Now, what if the seller contributes less or nothing towards the buyer's broker compensation? Well, the buyer will then be responsible for the remaining balance unless there's another written agreement adjusting your compensation. Realtor members, non-realtor members, MLS participants, you can always amend the agreement to adjust your fee down. Towards the end of this video, we will cover the cooperative compensation supplement in detail. If your buyer wants to negotiate the buyer agent compensation as part of their offer, we recommend that you prepare the compensation supplement and sending it along with any offer. Some agents have mentioned that they plan to call listing agents and have them ask the seller if the seller is offering any compensation to a buyer's broker. We advise against this because NAR and MLS members, it could be seen as filtering listings based on compensation, which is prohibited by the settlement agreement. For all licensees, remember, until an offer is in writing and the buyer sees the estimate of costs of the transaction and the seller sees their estimated net proceeds, you're really dealing with hypotheticals. Terms that buyers and sellers agree on can change as life changes on a daily basis, and so do motivating factors. So you making a call to a listing agent saying, hey, will your seller pay a buyer's broker? They don't even know what you're offering yet. So assume that everything is negotiable because everything is negotiable. The rest of the buyer-broker agreement, like I mentioned at the beginning, is very similar to the previous version. So we're going to kind of fly through this portion. Paragraph 10 ensures that the buyer knows that you won't order any products or services on their behalf without their permission. And if you do, you're not responsible for paying for those services. Always get written permission from your client if you're ordering products or services on their behalf, and keep it in your compliance file with your brokerage. You want to have something in writing that says this buyer is authorizing me to do this on their behalf. Paragraph 11 states that the buyer understands that they're not the only ones in the marketplace, they're not the only ones looking at these particular types of properties, and that you or other agents within your brokerage, you might be helping other buyers looking for similar properties, and you might be working with them. So paragraph 11 gives them that notice. Paragraph 12 confirms that you'll provide services in compliance with fair housing laws. Paragraph 13 says that if buyers sign two separate buyer-broker agreements, with the same terms with the broker, then they can be taken together as one document. Paragraph 14 ensures the buyer will receive a copy of the agreement after it's signed, along with a copy of brokerage duties and services disclosure as required by Title 59, Section 858-355.1. And you want to keep this in mind because that is a statute that is required for any brokerage agreements. So if you are using a different brokerage agreement, you want to make sure that the brokerage duties and responsibilities are included in those agreements. Paragraph 15 is the additional provision section where you can add specific terms that are agreed upon by you and your client. For example, if your client wants the agreement to apply only to a specific property, you can add that language there. And finally, we have the signature page, which you're all very familiar with. We have one more short form, that cooperative compensation supplement, to review, and that this is going to help you when negotiating your compensation to be paid by the seller included in the purchase price. So you're working with a buyer who has a signed buyer brokerage agreement and you found the perfect property for them. They're ready to make an offer, but how do you know if the seller is offering compensation or even willing to contribute to your fee as the buyer's broker? That's where this cooperative compensation supplement comes in. This new form lets you negotiate your compensation during the offer phase by attaching it to the contract. Now, if you're using this form, make certain that you select the appropriate box on page 1 of the purchase contract that says Cooperative Compensation Supplement. Checking that box will ensure that the supplement is actually part of the offer or part of the contract. This form is very short and very simple. The first provision states that the seller will compensate the buyer's broker. You can fill out either a specific dollar amount or a percentage of the final sales price. The second provision states that the compensation will be included in the final sales price of the property. The third provision states that the compensation is due and payable at closing, and both buyer and seller authorize the payment to the buyer's broker. The fourth provision states that the supplement is binding and that if the contract is assigned, the terms remain the same. The fifth provision says that the parties signing the document have read and understand and agree to the terms of the supplement. So you'll use this form to negotiate your compensation instead of writing anything in the additional provisions of the contract concerning cooperative compensation. This is a very straightforward way to ensure everyone is on the same page regarding compensation.